Good afternoon from a hot and humid Washington, D.C. This is Chris Hattingh, Executive Director of CRA, back in D.C. after I spent some time here earlier in March this year, undertaking a trip here mostly for an intellectual property conference I was invited to attend, but also having managed to arrange a few other meetings around that conference with, amongst others, senior US officials, trying to get a sense of the latest in terms of the South Africa-US relations, things around the G20, tariffs, and the economic implications, of course. Um, the kind of engagements that we present our briefings in which we detail economic and political data, as well as the data that we collect in our surveys every year on South Africa to audiences in places such as Washington and other capitals around the world. Part of that economic data with which South Africans are unfortunately very familiar is that between 2012 2023, South Africa averaged 0.8% GDP growth, very consistently high unemployment, of course, incredibly high rates of crime that affect all South Africans across the board. And we present that information and that data to lawmakers and contacts and think tank individuals so that they can make as informed policy and other decisions as possible. So that's just some context on my latest trip here to Washington to give some immediate feedback, some first impressions. Number one is that there's a growing sense of frustration on Capitol Hill with the South African government and with the ANC specifically, where the US Trump administration feels they've tried to send direct and indirect signals. They've met with the South African government, of course, when President Ramaphosa was here early in the year, but they've also met with other representatives or entities from South Africa, including political parties, civil society, and others, and they're just not getting the feedback that they think they should be getting from South Africa. So we don't see any kind of step change, a down in terms of a sort of downward step change from the US side in the engagements with South Africa. It remains not strongly antagonistic, I would say, but it is much more the case that the US, the administration, that lawmakers are asking serious questions about where South Africa wants to go, not only in terms of its foreign policy alignment, but its domestic policy. So given the potential that South Africa has, given how economically it has criminally underperformed, really, there's a sense of, especially here in Washington, if not other places around the world as well, maybe in Europe as well, that why is South Africa not making the kind of domestic policy choices that would be to the benefit of South African citizens firstly, and then of course help from a sort of attracting investment point of view. So number one, a growing sense of frustration from the US side. Number two as well, asking questions about the GNU, whether it's performing, how things can improve, and if so, what sort of route that could possibly take. And then maybe number three, in terms of South Africa's foreign policy and geopolitical alignment, what role does it want to play? So does it want to be an active and responsible role player in its region, from a security point of view, from an economic point of view, but also what is South Africa doing in terms of just addressing basic issues around crime and security, immigration control, those kinds of issues. So this isn't to say, of course, given that the relationship is on very thin ice, as it were, that there isn't a desire from Washington to make some kind of deal in the trade sense, but also just in the broader relationship between the US and South Africa. There is a desire, and it remains a very strong positive inclination towards the people of South Africa, towards the sort of prosperity of the country, and wanting the country to go in that positive direction, and trying to figure out how the US should engage in that regard, what role the US, how best the US should play the vision that it now has under President Trump for its geopolitical engagements and foreign policy. So yeah, I think there's every opportunity for a deal to be made, but again, it requires substantive policy steps from South Africa. Also, part of the issue is that South Africa has focused so much on the trade and tariff issues as pure trade and tariff and economic issues, where more and more in geopolitics we're seeing the sort of mixing of economic trade matters with other non-economic and trade matters. And from the South African side, from DIRCO, from DTIC, there hasn't necessarily been that shift or that acceptance that it's not just going to be pure trade that gets purchase here in the new moment that is the sort of that is taking place now in Washington. It's a longer term change, we think, in US foreign policy that is not just focused on and confined to President Trump. This is a new kind of era that we're entering in geopolitics, and it's not clear that South Africa has the skills, the capacity to deal with more creative diplomacy, creative deal making in this point in time. Probably at the moment, the risk, of course, that South Africa, that the ANC specifically, just defaults to old alliances where it's comfortable, where it feels the warm embrace of liberation movements. It doesn't have to deal with the reality of the moment that is presented here in Washington, but also in other places where other investors, other trading partners in South Africa could also become more transactional. And the question is whether South Africa can deal with that adequately at this point in time. Yeah, so those are just some initial thoughts on current South Africa-US relations. Unclear whether President Trump will attend the G20 summit in November, of course, this year in Johannesburg. What can South Africa do in a positive sense to attract US attention, to shift in any kind of meaningful way what the US feels hasn't been good from the South African side? Let's see if the South African government takes some of this kind of information and messaging in a positive sense. They have not really done so. They tend to not engage favorably with non-state entities that come to Washington, such as we saw earlier this year. They very much still want things to be done purely state to state. But I think this point in time in South Africa-US relations, as I mentioned, this current geopolitical moment does call for more creative diplomacy, more creative engagement. So yeah, look forward to sharing more information as we receive it, more analysis from the CRA coming your way. Thank you all very much for watching, and we'll talk to you all again next time. From Washington, DC, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.